Indeed, this has been a long time coming. By the way, thank you all for coming. You braved a snow day. You all individually wondered whether this was going to be canceled because of the icy roads. You didn't see anything on the Twitter feed, so you came, and when you know it actually worked. For those of you who don't know what the Twitter feed is, maybe you'll find it as encountered in the top. But yeah, so this is meant to be sort of looking 10 years into the future about where AI is going to eventually be. What is AI and where is it heading? I agreed to this talk at the beginning of the academic year with Mark, but then I realized it's not 10 years ahead anymore, so I had to update the title of the talk. Still the same talk, but the predictions So I should say I'm the director of a new AI center at UBC called CAIDA, the Center for Artificial Intelligence Decision Making and Action. And it's really ballooned. Most of these things happen because a bunch of people decide they want to make a center. We happen because the university decided they wanted us to make a center. So we really have been kind of a push rather than pull kind of model, and there's just so much appetite for AI. It's really just shaking things up at UBC. So in a couple of years of very informally being a center, we now have 90 faculty members from 27 different departments on campus who are members of the center, and we're still going. So some of you might come up to me afterwards and say that we should make it 91. So I want to tell you about the sort of fundamental thing I want you to know is that something happened recently in AI that changed the game, and I want to tell you that that's true, because those of us working in the field think that's obvious and think it doesn't need to be said, but something I've learned in going around and speaking with people outside of computer science is that the word hasn't gotten out yet. So I want to tell you about this. I want to tell you what it isn't, which is most of the things you're scared about, and I want to tell you what it is, because maybe you should be scared about that too. And then we can think together about where it's taking us and what it might mean for us. So I'm going to begin by telling you, kind of in a slide, what we even mean by the term artificial intelligence, because it's a slippery concept and it kind of has a constantly changing meaning. It's badly overhyped, so it's hard to even have a conversation about this thing until we can agree on what we mean by it. So there are competing definitions even within the field. You can't get a bunch of AI scientists to agree on what AI is. But I think one of the most useful things that you can say is it's the study, design, and development of computational processes for solving problems that previously only people could do. And you'll notice a paradox in that definition, which is that once something starts working well enough that previously no longer applies to it, then it stops being AI. And you might think this is a bug in the definition, but if we think about the sociology of the term AI, this is indeed how it gets used. So one generation's AI is the next generation's information technology, and AI becomes something completely different. Multitasking, for those of you who know what multitasking is, was invented as an AI technology in the 50s and 60s. Nobody thinks of it as AI today. The face recognition systems that you use to log into a modern iPhone or Android phone were a really hard AI problem until half a decade ago. Now it's a commodified thing. Everyone completely understands that computers can recognize faces. We don't think of it as being artificially intelligent anymore. And if you still do, give it 5 years and you won't anymore. So AI is, I like to think of it as kind of the incubator lab for computer science. It's the place in computer science where people think crazy things about what computers might be able to do. They work kind of on the bleeding edge where things don't really work yet, so there's a lot of sloppiness and ideas that don't pan out and competing factions of how things might play out. And then, eventually something becomes successful and the rest of the discipline claims ownership for it, and AI moves on and becomes something else. But these days, it's pretty hard to think of a part of computer science that is not being profoundly shaped by AI and what's been going on lately in AI. So much for AI. So now I want to tell you now in one slide a brief history of AI. What do we mean when we talk about AI as a kind of historical phenomenon? And how have things been panning out, and how have people been feeling about it? I'm going to do this by kind of the biggest benchmark that people in the field of AI use, which is comparing the performance of a system to the performance of people. So, when you've made it in AI is when you can do a task at least as well as people can do that same task. And why is that an interesting benchmark for us? Because as computer scientists, we believe that intelligence is fundamentally computational. We don't think that reasoning in our brains happens by magic or by angels dancing on the head of a pin. We believe that there's fundamentally a kind of computational process happening where I look at your face and I say, I've seen that guy before somewhere. Or, you give me a word puzzle and I sort of reason through it and I decide what the answer might be. I think that's fundamentally a computational task. And so human beings are existence proof. Humans show us that this thing can be done. As an engineer, you always have to worry that some problem you've set for yourself is too hard. It just doesn't have a solution. But humanity is walking around shoving in our face the fact that this thing can be done. And so it's a challenge to us as computer scientists that we haven't been able to figure out the principles that people are using to solve these problems. And so we know we've done something when there's a clearly identified computational task that people can do, and we can finally bring our techniques to the point where we can do it too. So the term artificial intelligence was proposed back in 1955 when a bunch of young white men got together at Dartmouth University on the east coast of the United States and had a summer conference proposing something called a research project on artificial intelligence. And they coined this term. There were a bunch of people who went on to become very famous. Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert and Alan Newell and John McCarthy, names that if you knew about who they were, you probably wouldn't be at this talk. But never mind, they're big foundational figures in the development of the idea of AI. This was kind of at the early days of the computer revolution, and this was the first time that a bunch of kind of luminaries got together and said, we think we could get computers to actually exhibit intelligence. And they sketched out some ideas for what that might look like. And this was also where the predicting 10 or 20 years into the future game got started with AI. And they made a bunch of predictions about what was going to happen. And they were horribly, laughably, embarrassingly wrong. I think among their predictions was that in, I forget the time scale, 10 or 20 years, a computer would compose a symphony that would be better than symphonies composed by humans. And we're still nowhere closer to that goal today than we were in 1955. They made a bunch of bold predictions that, they made a bunch of predictions about things like machine translation, that today we have sort of passable machine translation systems, but nobody would confuse them with the behavior of a skilled human translator. So really, we saw, even looking at these early antecedents, just how hard this task was going to be and how easy it was going to be to predict that it was going to be easier than it was. So then we fast forward to 1982 is the first really meaningful example I can think of a system that exhibited human-level performance on an AI task. So that's a pretty long, sad interregnum between 1955 and 1982. It's not that nothing happened, but they didn't really get to the level of human performance on just about anything. There was actually a period there in the 60s called the AI winter, when some mathematicians made a mathematical argument that showed that some of the things that had been promised by the early AI people weren't just looking unlikely, but were mathematically impossible the way that they said it was going to be, and the whole thing was massively overpromising, and all the funders pulled funding from AI and said this thing is a disaster, and there was sort of a decade where nobody could even be funded to work in the field. And they kind of soldiered through, and then there was sort of a breakthrough, and they said, oh, what if we did this other mathematical thing that gets around the problem, and this sort of restarted again. This system played the game of Othello. How many of you here have ever played Othello? As you can see, it's the kind of thing humans love to do. Usually a half dozen of you have done it. Nevertheless, there's a world champion Othello player out there because why not? There's a world champion everything. Some guy played Othello really well, and it's a game where you put these little black and white tiles on the board, and if you can surround some of these tiles, you flip their tiles to the other color, and you try to get the whole board to be one color. it's the kind of game that teenagers play. It's not the kind of game that grandmasters play, but it's a somewhat challenging game, and AI was able to. But it's a very well-defined kind of reasoning task. It's very clear what the legal things you can do in Othello is. It's clear whether you're winning or losing. It's a nice little sandbox problem that incorporates something like reasoning that people know how to do, and AI managed to do it. Good job, AI. Board games kind of continue to be a good test bed for thinking about AI problems because they're intellectually captivating. That's why we like them. They take some skill to do well at, but they're incredibly clean and well-defined, and they give us a good test bed for thinking about reasoning without a lot of the messiness that the world contains. So another key breakthrough here came in '95. Chinook was a checkers game player. Checkers is much more complex than Othello. This was actually led by Jonathan Schaefer, who's a professor at the University of Alberta. We'll hear from the University of Alberta again. They actually turned out to be very good in game playing AI, and this was sort of the beginning of their dominance in that space. Shortly afterwards, some of you might remember this if you're old like me, or in some cases maybe even older than me, that IBM in the 90s had this highly publicized set of games against Garry Kasparov, who was the world grandmaster champion of chess, and they had this computer called Deep Blue play against Garry Kasparov in a series of 7 games, and in the first round, Kasparov won, but only slightly, and a couple years later they came with a stronger AI, and it beat him, and there's this sort of iconic picture of Kasparov holding his head in his hands, having been vanquished by a computer, saying, humans have lost the edge, the computers are taking over. And, of course, most of us could have been beaten by a chess player, running on a VIC-20 because we played such lousy chess to begin with. So I'm not really sure that this was, the moment where humanity lost what it truly means to be human. But at least it was a milestone that both had been particularly hard to achieve and that showed that something had been done. Incidentally, the techniques that were used to build Deep Blue were pretty disappointing. IBM mostly threw money at the problem. They bought a lot of computers. One of the big things that changed between 1995 and 1997, when the 2 different rounds of games, was the computers got faster in the meantime, and so the same kinds of ideas just worked better on faster computers. This incidentally will be a theme. The rising speed of computers has been a non-trivial part of the AI success story. But at the end it was pretty much search. It was pretty much just trying lots of alternatives and seeing what worked out. And this didn't look like it paved the way forwards for all the other things that we wanted to do with AI. Let me move on. So AI also started to make its way into space exploration. So the first system that actually used AI that was sent into space, which is such a mainstay of science fiction, actually only happened in '98, where there was a deep space probe that was sent out into the outer reaches of the solar system, and they wanted it to be able to deal with equipment failures and behave differently when something goes wrong in the kind of inevitable decay of this thing out into the far reaches of the solar system, and speed of light lags and power constraints meant that they couldn't just remotely operate it in these circumstances, so they had to make it autonomous. And you might think by '98, surely we knew how to do this, but no, this was really groundbreaking stuff. It was still really primitive what it was able to do, but getting it to the point where you would want to trust a hundreds of millions of dollars space probe that you were never going to get to send another one with this thing, flying by wire, took till 1998. Then 2011, we had another major moment where IBM's Watson, which was again kind of a big publicity show around an AI system by IBM, this time for Jeopardy play, won a Jeopardy contest. You actually see here, I can't read the tiny writing here, but Brad Rutter, right, the guy on the right there, is the very guy who's in the greatest of all time tournament happening right now in Jeopardy. And as of today, he's apparently doing pretty badly. But he did badly there too because he got beaten by a computer. And on the one hand, again, you might sort of feel like, how is it a hard thing for a computer to play Jeopardy? It sounds like asking, who knows more facts, Wikipedia or some guy. Sort of, and like, who's going to have a speed advantage on buzzing in, too? And it doesn't maybe seem like it ought to be that hard. But Jeopardy has a lot of wordplay and double meanings. It has a lot of cultural knowledge. You have to chain together different facts. This kind of stuff is tricky to do reliably, and it's all happening in natural language. So this was actually a more impressive AI achievement than the ones that we talked about before, in the sense that it has to deal with really messy kind of human experience. Although in the end it did kind of look a lot like web search or something like Wikipedia running on top of some kind of natural language modules. Then we get to 2014, and here's where the story starts to change. So there was a paper called Deep Face, Closing the Gap to Human-Level Performance in Face Verification, that showed how to use a really new machine learning methodology called deep learning to recognize human faces at the level of quality that people use. And this is the research paper that introduced the idea, and it was published in 2014. So all of this face recognition stuff that you're hearing about, wasn't even a research technology in 2013. This really has just come about in the last kind of 5 years. And this was built on top of this neural network idea, this new neural network architecture called deep learning, which was an old idea. It was actually an idea about what neural networks might be capable of that caused the AI winter back in the 60s. And it was worked by a Canadian deep learning neural network researcher named Jeff Hinton, who's at the University of Toronto, that resuscitated things after the AI winter, an idea called backpropagation for having multiple layer neural networks that kind of got things rebooted again. But ever since then, people have been sneering at neural networks and saying it was this sort of very simplistic notion of how the brain works, and sort of this biological metaphor that didn't really comport very well with the biology, and there tended to be better machine learning approaches than deep learning when you had practical problems to solve, but there was this sort of small group that kept soldiering on. And this is when they showed that essentially the ideas that they had had since the 80s worked really well when you had fast enough computers. It's pretty much what happened. A couple of new ideas were introduced, but nothing really earth-shattering. It was mostly just a matter of scale. Enough data and fast enough computers, and things started changing, and you could do things like face recognition. Around about the same time, a group that spun off from the University of Alberta and worked at a company called DeepMind built a reinforcement learning algorithm that learned how to play Atari games. And what they gave this thing was the raw pixel output from an Atari game. So literally, like the RGB values of all of the pixels on the screen of that were produced by the Atari, plus the score actually given as a number. So they cheated a little bit with the score. They didn't make it do character recognition. And it knew the controller buttons, so it could push left, right, up, down, A, B, whatever the controller buttons are in an Atari. It didn't know what these buttons did. It just knew the buttons. And then they just hooked it up to an Atari and said, try to get the highest score you can get. Your purpose in the world is to maximize your score. And they built something that could play amazingly good Atari. And it would get trained on one Atari game, and it couldn't do anything but play that one Atari game. You could take the same algorithm and give it a different Atari game and train it for a phenomenally atrocious amount of time, burning millions of dollars of computer time training this thing, and at the end it could play exceed human level performance on that next Atari game. And that was pretty exciting because it was one idea for solving these very different problems. Again, it was based on this deep learning idea for trying to understand how to reason about this raw signal input. And these two breakthroughs really shook everybody up. DeepMind got bought by Google. They're based in London with an office also in Edmonton, and they basically continue to do sort of long-range AI research. One last breakthrough in that space, kind of about the same time that set the tone, was something called ImageNet. So it was an idea of taking a really large number of images that are available on the internet that people have just taken of their kids on the beach or just whatever, with text labels, and then trying to predict, this is a picture of a cat, this is a picture of a dog, This is a picture of two boys playing on the beach, and trying to eventually build something that can be shown a new image that it's never seen before, and you ask it, is this a cat or a dog? And it can say this is a cat. And literally that's the whole story. Right? You just show it a bunch of images, and you say that's a picture of a cat. You don't tell it anything about a cat. You don't tell it how to find the cat from the background. You don't tell it which part of the cat is poking out from the blanket. You really only just show it a picture and claim that it has a cat in it. And you do this enough times with enough pictures, this approach is able to just figure out what a cat looks like. And again, this is a problem that had been incredibly hard. People have been working on this kind of image recognition problem for a long time, and were astounded that this could be made to work. Then things started speeding up. This same technology just started being useful for all kinds of things. So the DeepMind group, which was owned by Google, then beat a top human player at the game of Go, which is probably a game you know less well than chess. It's a Japanese board game. But for some mathematical reasons, it is much, much harder for a computer to play than chess, because the number of moves that are possible to play at every board position is very much bigger. And so you can't do exhaustive search like people do in chess, because the exponential branching factor is too high. You can't explore the space to any depth. So the fact that they were able to do something here, so the fact that people could play this game was really a puzzle, because it didn't make sense that the people were obviously doing something very different from search, the way the chess playing programs worked, and it was amazing that this worked. In 2017, we saw self-driving cars starting to operate on the streets with human drivers and pedestrians. You all know that didn't go completely smoothly. There was a fatality in Phoenix, Arizona, where somebody was pushing a shopping cart across the street, not at a crossing in the middle of the night, and this was something the car didn't know how to recognize. The woman was killed. It actually turns out in the analysis of this that the car did recognize that there was a pedestrian on the street, but there was a safety driver, and the car had been programmed not to suddenly stop because they didn't want false positives that the car would just suddenly stop, and that might be dangerous. And the safety driver was supposed to intervene in cases like this, but imagine what a terrible job this is, of being a safety driver, driving around 8 hours a day with a car that just drives itself fine. And you're supposed to wait for the one time in sort of thousands of hours of driving where you have to slam on the brakes and do it right, or you'll hit a woman pushing a shopping cart, which is what happened. So this has caused a reevaluation of the sort of legal policy around the rollout of self-driving cars. But nevertheless, the technology has been demonstrated to work remarkably well. The Alberta group and another group at Carnegie Mellon University have sort of competing systems, both of which had sort of different claims for having built the best heads-up Texas no-limit poker player, which, again, for mathematical reasons, is more challenging than some of the board games that I told you about before. Essentially, that's because in poker, you have to reason about what cards your opponent might have and what cards might be coming. You have to think about uncertain probabilities. Whereas in board games like chess and Go, everybody knows everything. You can see the whole board. You don't have to say, I wonder if, that square right there contains his knight or his queen. You can just look and see it. So having to reason about these kinds of uncertainties leads to a very different kind of strategic situation. That's why poker has been an important challenge for AI researchers. We now saw AI robots rolling around on Mars. And now there's just a flood of human-level milestones. There's very recently conversational speech systems have been starting to work decently well. Dermatologist-level classification of skin cancer. How many people here know what Dota 2 is? More of you than know what Othello is. So Dota 2 is a video game that people play, but more to the point, people pay money to watch other people play. That's actually a thing. If it doesn't make sense to you, ask your kids. If it doesn't make sense to them, ask your grandkids. But it's really a thing. It's sort of sports. In video games, it's a complicated game to play well, so AI systems that can play this game well were pretty tricky to achieve. Detecting prostate cancer at the level of radiologists. answering multiple choice questions like on an SAT, so this kind of question answering testing. And very recently, a Chinese to English translation system that on some benchmarks works as well as a human translator. Academics have noticed that something exciting is going on in AI, and AI conferences have seen insane attendance. So I heard a colleague say that registration for NeurIPS, which is the sort of biggest AI conference, which actually was in Vancouver in December and will be in Vancouver again next December, is more popular than Burning Man, but less popular than Beyonce in terms of how quickly it sells out. So it sells out in hours, but not in seconds. But it sells out the Vancouver Convention Center on the same day the tickets become available. I mean, who's ever heard of an academic conference where if you don't buy tickets right the day they go on sale, you can't go? It's quite absurd. And it's not just NeurIPS, it's kind of everything. So people have noticed that something is going on. And to its credit, the Canadian government has noticed that something is going on. So actually, Canada was the first country to have a national AI strategy where they actually funded as a line item in the Canadian budget a $120 million investment in AI research. Very sadly, they did this in a Byzantine, smoke-filled room, closed process that decided with no public input where those centers were going to be, and Vancouver was not one of them, which was a travesty and a mistake because we had so many great AI people in Vancouver. But congratulations, Toronto, Montreal, and Edmonton. A rising tide lifts all boats and all that, but what a shame. The grad students have noticed too. Right? They look to the students to find out what's really going on. So if I crunch the numbers on admissions data to the computer science department at UBC, and looking from 2016-17 to 2018-19, we don't quite have the 19-20 data yet. Over that 2-year period, we have almost a doubling in the number of grad students applying to our department, which is pretty absurd. We've got like under 50 full-time research faculty, so we have like 2,000 grad students applying for our program. Pretty terrible. But looking at that, 63% of those applicants wanted to work in AI, and we've got a half dozen people who work in AI. So this area is just kind of off the charts. People have really noticed that something is going on. So, oops, okay. So why is this happening right now? Why is 2014, 2015 the year that everything kind of took off? Raise your hand if you've heard of Moore's Law. Do you know what Moore's Law is? More of you than know about Dota 2, but still not everybody. Okay. So Moore's Law is a prediction that was made in the 70s by Gordon Moore, who I think is the CEO of Intel, an executive at Intel. And he predicted that the number of transistors on the chip was going to double every 18 months. And this was mostly an argument actually about the way financing works in the semiconductor industry. But it was sort of popularly interpreted as meaning that computers were going to get faster every kind of year and a half to 2 years. They were going to double in speed. Because for a long time, transistor count and clock speed of a computer tracked with each other. And so if you, like me, did computing in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, you were familiar with this period of time where the clock speed of a computer, which I'm showing here in this color, was doubling. So this is a log scale, right? So a linear relationship on a log scale means doubling. So we were seeing, this tremendous rate of growth in computer speed, and indeed, every time you bought a new computer, it was just mind-numbingly faster than the computer you had before. And if you have the perception that that's not true anymore, you're not wrong. You'll see that around sort of 2005, it flattened out. Clock speed stopped improving. The reason is we started hitting fundamental physical limits. So there's some speed of light, places where actually the speed of light binds. You can only cover so much distance at the speed of light within a clock cycle. As you make clock cycles shorter and shorter, this actually starts to be binding. So chips can't get any bigger and still kind of propagate a signal from one side of the chip to the other within a clock cycle. And more importantly, heat started being a problem. So you have to run these things hotter and hotter to make them operate faster and faster. And at some point, the power draw becomes too big, and the center of the chip would melt. And so we kind of hit a maximum clock speed we could get to. But if you feel like what that means is that computers stop getting better, you would be wrong, because the number of transistors on a chip has nevertheless continued its exponential march, which I was quite surprised. There aren't a lot of cases where somebody has predicted that something was going to grow exponentially over a 50-year period that has turned out to be right. It's very hard to find a good Moore's law graph, so I actually made this one myself by actually going and combing a bunch of data about available processors and their clock speeds. But I made this like 6 months ago, so this is pretty much right up to date. And you can see the exponential fit. It's still a really good fit. This really looks linear on the log scale. Surely it's not going to continue forever, right? At some point, this is going to have to top out just because of physical limits. But we haven't gotten there yet. And we're now at the point where we have sort of 10 to the power of 11 transistors on a chip. I don't want to suggest to you that transistors and neurons are the same thing, but look at the complexity of a brain of these different creatures and think about this in terms of scale. We're now starting to get to the point where we're on the same order of, maybe it takes hundreds or thousands of transistors to simulate a neuron, or tens of thousands. But we're sort of getting into this kind of territory then, if so, right? We're getting to the sort of the complexity of a chip being like a lower order animal. And that might be kind of one reason. So all of these additional transistors have basically made data centers powerful, power efficient, and cheap. And so that's why you've heard about the cloud, right? The cloud is all of these new transistors living off in warehouses somewhere, doing your computing for you. And also, incidentally, that's why you're now able to carry around a phone, which is a more powerful computer than the computer you had on your desk in the 90s, because the power demands, these transistors are being used for better power demands. So this basically is backing up the statement that these neural network ideas from back in the day all of a sudden are able to do more. Okay, so this is the part of the talk where I tell you about how we got to where we are now, where we are today. Let me now show you some visual examples of this. So everyone's favorite AI example is self-driving cars. So here's a video that I found online. You can see the source on the side if you want to follow it up. And a sort of snippet that I cut from it showing kind of what's possible with self-driving cars today and where the limitations are.
Self-driving vehicles are cars or trucks in which human drivers are never required to take control to safely operate the vehicle, also known as autonomous or driverless cars. They combine sensors and software to control, navigate, and drive the vehicle. Various self-driving technologies have been developed by Google, Uber, Tesla, Nissan, and other major automakers, researchers, and technology companies. While design details vary, most self-driving systems create and maintain an internal map of their surroundings, based on a wide array of sensors, like radar. Uber's self-driving prototypes use 64 laser beams, along with other sensors, to construct their internal map. Google's prototypes have at various stages used lasers, radar, high-powered cameras, and sonar. Software then processes these inputs, plots a path, and sends instructions to the vehicle's actuators, which control acceleration, braking, and steering. Hard-coded rules like obstacle avoidance algorithms, predictive modeling, and smart object discrimination, for example knowing the difference between a bicycle and a motorcycle, help the software follow traffic rules and navigate obstacles. Partially autonomous vehicles may require a human driver to intervene if the system encounters uncertainty. Fully autonomous vehicles may not even offer a steering wheel. Essentially, self-driving cars are at the point where they can safely drive under ideal conditions. But what about when it's snowing and the car's sensors are coated in ice? Manufacturers are trying to make a series of redundancies to ensure that if one system fails, there are several others to pick up the slack. This is easier said than done.
I think today is a pretty good reminder of why nobody wants to get in a self-driving car under arbitrary circumstances. The existing self-driving car prototypes are happening mostly in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Reno, Nevada, both of which share in common ideal weather and being very flat. And having Republican governments that are happy to allow experimentation on the roads, perhaps. But so that's where we are today. It's not perfect. It's easy to make jokes about it. But on the other hand, isn't it insane that we have robots driving cars? I mean, who thought that was going to happen in 2017? Here's another. We tend to think a lot about robotics when we think about AI. So I wanted to show you kind of the state of the art of robotics in 2020. So here's a little video about robotics.
Have you ever wondered how humans and robots work together at Amazon? From the moment a product enters our fulfillment center until it heads out to a customer, Amazon technology helps our associates in so many incredible ways.
Amazon introduced our drive unit robots in 2012, which led to 300,000 new full-time jobs.
These are the stow stations. They use artificial intelligence and computer vision.
Yeah, pretty cool.
This is the palletizer. It uses computer vision to stack totes of products.
There's so much cool technology that goes into this.
Oh yeah? Like what?
Well, like 2D imaging, a laser sensor, high motion performance, and 165 kilogram load capacity.
Wow! Amazing!
Our tech vests help communicate with the robots to keep us safe while working on the field.
I think your tech vest could use a little more tech.
Thanks, but I think my vest already has everything it needs.
Incredible!
I know, right?
With Amazon's human and robotic powers combined, we are building the future of technology together.
So I think this is at least as interesting from what it tells us about the fears that the public has about robotics, how a marketing campaign is going to try to address those fears, the way it's speaking about concerns about job loss, the way it's showcasing kind of a diverse workforce, the way it's showing the workforce being happy about the robots, the way it's trying to make it seem palatable to us today. So, I don't show you this as an uncritical Amazon shill, but it also shows you, Amazon isn't very public about letting people into their warehouses, and this is one of the best looks at what Amazon is doing right now. And their warehouses are pretty unambiguously the biggest kind of cutting-edge robotics deployments in the world today. Car manufacturers are pretty good too, but they're under more controlled conditions. So an Amazon warehouse at this point is basically a space that humans can't walk around in. The robots are kind of whizzing around, picking up these pallets and boxes, moving the boxes to these screening people who pick the stuff up that the robot gives them and puts them in the box, and then the box gets packaged up and taken off by other robots. And that's the only task that the humans still do better. And this is all working at scale, and it's all working in all of these messy objects of different sizes and shapes. And that's on the one hand impressive. That's the cutting edge today. On the other hand, you can see how far it has to go. You're not going to have a robot carpenter or gardener or handyman anytime soon. Like, you're not going to have Rosie, the Jetsons maid, coming and cleaning your house, doing arbitrary tasks. We still are at the point where robots, for example, basically can't pick up cloth. I recently saw a demo of a robot folding a shirt, and that was considered cutting edge, and it took it like 20 minutes. Because think about it, like manipulating a thing that changes its shape when you move it around, it's pretty tricky, right? We take it for granted, but that's a tough research problem today. A robotics researcher once said to me, if you're being pursued by a killer robot and you want to get away, just close a door that has a doorknob, because they don't know how to open it. They also have a lot of trouble with stairs. So, like still basic stuff is really just, we're not mechanically there in robotics yet. It's really a mechanical engineering problem. So most modern AI systems look much more boring. Right? They look like this and like this. These are the most sophisticated AI systems in the world today. So, the Google search box looks pretty trivial, but there's a lot hiding behind it. And this is really what's hiding behind it, a massive data center that you never get to see that's probably built somewhere very close to a hydroelectric plant, because it doesn't really matter where it would be. So actually situating it somewhere close to a power source is mostly what they do. Many of these data centers now are actually built inside shipping containers so that you can ship the shipping container by the power plant, plug it in from the outside, and you never have to go in. Google is looking at submerged data centers that would actually run on tidal power and that would be cooled by being underwater. Crazy stuff. But these enormous data centers are really what you should actually picture when you think of an AI system, rather than robots running around doing things, which is what the movies would have you think about. So let me say a little bit more about machine learning. I've mentioned this phrase before. What do I mean when I talk about machine learning? Narrowly, machine learning means learning a predictive model from data. So seeing a lot of examples of some relationship, like here are some pixels and that was a dog, here are some pixels and that was also a dog, even though they're completely different pixels. Here's something that looks pretty similar, but that was a cat. and then you're supposed to learn the relationship. That's kind of narrowly what machine learning means. More broadly, you can think of it as an approach to programming a computer where instead of telling it how to do something, which is how we normally think of programming, giving a set of instructions, instead you show it examples of what you want it to do, and you say, do it like that. So broadly, it's kind of a learn by showing instead of by breaking down a task kind of approach to programming. And machine learning is kind of the hot trend of the moment. It will surely run its course at some point and become commodified. But right now, this is where a lot of the heat and action is. It's headed towards increasing data collection. Machine learning methods are really data hungry. So something that we've recently learned over the last kind of half decade is that when you have a lot of data, it does pretty well, and when you have really a lot of data, it's even better, and when you have yet more data than that, it's better still. And so these machine learning methods just have a kind of insatiable desire for more and more and more data to learn from. And that's leading to ubiquitous sensors recording our environments that are feeding into these machine learning methods, and increasing behavior tracking. So you might not know just how much you're tracked online. Maybe sometimes you do know because you leave something in your shopping cart and then it follows you around on ads on unrelated web pages for the next 2 weeks. But you're being modeled to increasingly sophisticated extent online in order to advertise things to you, and that's another example of this data gathering that sort of is fueling machine learning. It's going to be used mostly for kind of signal processing kinds of tasks. That's where we have the most success today. So image understanding, text understanding, speech understanding is a big deal. Right now, we're doing a lot better on kind of image kind of stuff than we're doing on language kind of stuff. Language is harder for reasons that many of you really understand. It's ambiguous, it's freighted with multiple meanings, it involves cultural context. Getting all of this stuff right is tricky, but a lot of progress is being made right now in language-related tasks. And I don't think we're anywhere close to the point where a computer is going to write a poem that truly moves you and says something new. But we might be getting to the point where the computer broadly understands what you mean when you speak colloquially. So I think we're kind of getting to that point where you can be functional in language without being innovative in language. Machine learning is being used for increasing personalization and profiling of people. So we're going to be able to say to Spotify, play me something a little bit more upbeat, and have it notice what it's playing now and what you've liked historically in the past. And then you could say, no, not like that, maybe something a bit more like this. And it could play not the artist you just mentioned, but it could be informed by that. This kind of trying to understand preferences and query large sets of possible alternatives. We're going to see a lot more of that kind of thing. And ultimately, computers that program themselves in much richer ways just through experience rather than through manual instructions. We're starting to see the virtual and physical worlds intersecting more and more. So we're seeing smarter and smarter interfaces. We're discovering, a lot of, like Apple, for example, is mostly an interface company, right? Mostly what they do really well is design easier to more comfortable interfaces around commodified technology that already exists. And we've seen that could make them one of the most valuable companies in the world, how much of a desire there is for us to just interface more comfortably with technology. AI is going to make this continue to work better and better. Think of things like remote controls and microwaves and clocks and how clunky they are, how awkward, how you sort of have to conform yourself to the technology rather than having it conform itself to you. That's going to change. We're starting to see augmented reality, which means superimposing some kind of constructed reality on the physical world using glasses or holding up a phone. Right now, the kinds of things we see are toys, Pokemon Go, and little demos that aren't really compelling. We haven't really seen the killer app for augmented reality, but I think that's bound to happen, where being able to supply useful information on the world could be useful. For example, Google Glass had this idea that you would go around wearing these glasses, and I would see somebody that I met 2 years ago, and I don't remember them, but it queries them and gives me a little, contact card, and here's the person, and here's, what you've done with them before. You can imagine that kind of thing being useful, except everyone hated it. Learning wearing Google Glasses, it's like, you're spying on me. Socially, it didn't work out at all. But something in that space, I think, is inevitable. And we're going to see systems that are much more context aware, that can understand, I'm in a meeting right now, don't interrupt me. You can see what I'm doing. When do I want you to intervene in some kind of way? When do I not? And systems that are programmable through kind of natural language requests, through context, through observing how I interject with them, instead of in these very clunky ways we have now. Where we're going to see a lot of assistance for the elderly, for children, for the disabled, in educational contexts. These are all places where right now we're doing a pretty terrible job. There's a lot of scope for improvement here. But there are also cases where really mechanistic solutions are not going to work. So it's pretty clear that we're going to have to do a lot better technologically than we're doing now to move the needle in these domains, but there's a lot of scope for something to happen. Another place we're sure to see more deployment of AI is in military applications, unfortunately. Here's the best video I could find of kind of the current state-of-the-art of AI technologies for the military.
Weapons of the future won't need soldiers or commanders to operate them, because they will be able to make the decision of what or whom to target themselves using artificial intelligence. The Pentagon is spending billions on developing a new generation of lethal autonomous weapons, or LAWs, like robotic fighter jets, missiles that decide what to attack, and ships that hunt enemy submarines. Recently, DARPA showed a system using a drone that could be bought from Amazon. When loaded with new AI software, it becomes a robot that can then hunt and identify armed men with AK-47s in a mock-up of a Middle Eastern village at a military testing range in the US. It was even capable of finding armed men when they were hidden in the shadows. If this system were to be armed like the Harop, or be able to guide a missile to the target, it could become a formidable hunting system. This sort of thing was once a preserve of Hollywood, but it will be controlling the future autonomous weapons within years rather than decades. These new weapons would offer unmatched speed and precision over any human-controlled system, and is now being called the biggest step change since the creation of gunpowder and nuclear weapons.
So I think this is something we should be thinking about a lot more, right? I think we should worry less about Terminator and RoboCop and a lot more about drone technology that already basically exists. It isn't going to get much fancier, being weaponized and used by police forces and governments. I think a theme for what I have to say today that you're probably already picking up on is, I think the technology is on the one hand less formidable than portrayed in the media, but on the other hand, despite its shortcomings, it's capable of more. Its social impacts are going to be greater than we maybe realize, and these things are happening now. So our governments are developing and deploying these kinds of technologies now. I mean, the second-ranking military commander in Iran was just assassinated using a drone. That the decision of firing that drone was made by a human. It wasn't an autonomous kill decision. But everything else about it is basically this kind of technology that we're talking about. And really the reasons why we don't have those kinds of drones making operational tactical decisions autonomously is mostly a social decision rather than a technical decision. And we might find that decision changing if the public doesn't care much about the distinction. Right now, policymakers think that the public cares about that distinction. I think there's obviously talk about AI weaponization, but this is not something that I think is getting enough attention, particularly because it's being driven by mostly the U.S. government, but by defense contractors and governments in the West. The other thing that we hear a lot about is the notion that the robots are going to take our jobs. I mean, hopefully we've already thought enough about whether we have to worry specifically about robots. Probably not. But we're certainly concerned about the economic impact of AI. That's why the Amazon infomercial that we just saw began by talking about how it had created so many jobs, whether you believed it or not. What's really going to happen with AI? I think it's likely that we're going to see increased mechanization of routine labor, and particularly we're going to see automation of low-end knowledge work. So, your gardener is probably safe. If you have a gardener, good for you. I don't know if you want gardeners anymore. But that's not a job that's going to be economical to have an AI system do anytime soon. It's lots of different tasks. You're working in uncontrolled environments, walking around in the mud, squishy things. You don't want to break the plants. This is not something a robot is going to do well. Your travel agent, on the other hand, you really should talk to your grandkids if you still have a travel agent, because nobody has a travel agent anymore, right? That's a category that computers completely blew up. That used to be considered an AI problem. It's actually kind of hard to search through all the plane schedules, find something sensible. That's a good example of something that used to be considered AI, and now nobody thinks it's AI. That's a good example of the kind of job that is susceptible to automation. It's one task. They're not doing lots of really variable things. It's very routine. It's the same thing over and over again. And it's an information, a knowledge work task. It's kind of a low-end knowledge work task that's the kind of thing computers do really well. It looks like the Google search box. It doesn't look like the robots in the garden. So I think, the AIs are not coming for your jobs, but they might be coming for your tasks. So I think what we're going to see is individual tasks getting automated away, which is nothing new. We've been seeing that ever since the Industrial Revolution. This wave of automation is maybe scarier because it has this story about robot intelligence associated with it, and it's quick. So we're probably going to see a social backlash coming against this automation. We're already starting to see it. We already have one candidate in the Democratic primary whose main platform has to do with a response to automation, which we certainly haven't seen before. He's a French candidate. He's probably going to drop out after the next debate, but he qualified for this one. So, like other waves of automation, AI is almost certainly going to make our societies richer. That's the effect of automation. It means that the same amount of human labor can be used to produce more stuff, can be used to do more stuff. So how rich you are is how much one unit of labor can be traded for. And this is going to mean that the same amount of labor can be leveraged for more output. So we're going to be richer as a society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the society is going to be richer as individuals. There's nothing in that kind of utilitarian analysis that says that the bottom 10%, or for that matter 80% of society is not going to be worse off. Just that society as a whole is going to be better off. And better off as measured in very, very utilitarian kinds of terms. But even so, I think, we tend, the dialogue in society right now tends to talk about jobs as though, the key purpose of the economy is to provide jobs, rather than the key purpose of the economy being to provide goods and services, right? I mean, we don't employ people in order to employ people. We employ people in order to allow them to have a place to live and things to eat. And, we might find at some point that we live in a post-scarcity economy. We might find that goods are so cheap to provide that, we don't need to trade our labor for them, because they're, we have 3D printing, we have, robot manufacturing. We really might come to a point where, we already see today, you can buy things in the dollar store that you would have had to save up for, 30 or 40 years ago. So we're already seeing, manufacturing getting to the point where stuff is just cheap. And, that could just continue to accelerate. I think we're also going to start, it's already a trend we see today, we're going to start to see human labor as a luxury good. So, today you can go to Old Navy and buy, clothes that are made very poorly and, in a kind of mechanized way that will fall apart quickly, or you can go to Main Street and buy really expensive clothes that were made by hand in Vancouver, where the stitching is uneven and, it kind of, every piece looks kind of different, and functionally it's just as good at being clothing, but it sort of signals that you bought something that was made by a human, and that's sort of a form of conspicuous consumption. That's a luxury good that shows, I'm choosing to wear an expensive thing that was made by a human. I think that trend might continue, where as robotic production becomes more widespread, human the evidence that something was made by humans is going to become kind of a luxury signifier. I think we should think a lot more than we do now about what the response to AI technologies is going to be. And I think there are probably many people here in the room who are not scientists, but social scientists or work elsewhere in the humanities. And I think this is something we should really all be thinking a lot more about, because I think the response to AI is going to be the story of the next couple of decades, much more than the question about what the technologies will do. I mean, I focused here on talking about what the technologies will do because we can't really think about the response if we don't know what we're responding to. But I think the response is going to be the real story. So I think we're likely to see a social backlash against AI at some point. Not a backlash of the form, why are we funding this thing, it doesn't work, but a backlash of the form, this thing works too well, we're scared of it, we want to get rid of it. You look at the huge social experiment happening in China of just AI and cameras pervading society. If that's a harbinger of what's to come around the world, I think it's going to surely provoke some hard questions at some point. That pendulum just can't fail to swing back. I think what AI is going to mean for childhood development is anyone's guess. Right now, young children are interacting with recommender systems like YouTube that are feeding back their own interest to them in a pretty scary way. If you haven't interacted with this stuff very recently, speaking as a parent of a young child, it's pretty amazing. And we're starting to see AI systems and young children co-creating content, because some of these content farms will produce many slight variations on the same song. And they'll put them all up onto YouTube, and they'll see which ones the kids watch. And then they'll make many slight variations on that version. And they'll iterate this process many times in a mostly automated fashion until you've got stuff that no human mind ever really thought about, except maybe the toddlers who are watching it. And that amplifies something that's of interest to toddlers. And maybe that's fantastic. Maybe it means we're finally making good children's programming. But maybe not, right? maybe we shouldn't just give kind of unfettered design access to developing minds. I mean, we should be a little bit more thoughtful about how we're raising our children. That's for children. I mean, what about adults? How are human relationships between adults going to be affected by the presence of always available social agents? I mean, look at how internet dating has changed human relationships even in the last decade. Think forward 20 or 30 years to this technology really working. I mean, internet dating is pretty bad right now, right? But this is, again, a kind of IT problem. Imagine what human relationships would look like if you could get a pretty good prediction of which people you would like before you ever met them. What would that do to an institution like Green College that's based on the serendipity of getting a bunch of dissimilar people together and making magic happen? Looking at Mark, look at all of you. At what point are we going to hit our inherent biological limitations? We're sort of augmenting ourselves with AI, but fundamentally we're not getting cognitively, emotionally smarter than we are now. We still have the same stupid failings that people have had for thousands of years. That's why Greek dramas are still fun to read. But at what point are we just going to get ourselves into trouble where we've given ourselves more capacity, but we don't really have more to draw on? And we're also, I think, another big story in the coming decades is going to be about legal impact. So we haven't really grappled legally with a lot of these questions yet. To what purposes is it okay to put big data? How do we assess the values and biases that are inherent in AI systems? We've seen a little bit about this in the press, but we're really just chipping away at the edges. If an autonomous car kills somebody, or an autonomous drone shoots a missile and kills a civilian, or your automatic door entry system decides that it isn't going to let racial minorities enter your house, who's responsible for this behavior if nobody made the individual decision? And what kinds of limits are we going to place on the use of autonomous technologies in war? We've been pretty ineffective at reining in technologies that already exist in war. This is going to be a big one. If you can send in inexpensive drones, kind of not at 30,000 feet, but down at the level of people, into a theater of war without risking any of your own soldiers, how is that going to change the dynamics of international relations? I think we've not thought enough about those questions. Okay, let me end by making a few predictions about what's going to happen in the next decade. I see myself as being an hour and 4 minutes in. I'm going to end probably in about 10 minutes or so. Am I kind of on track here? All right. So I think we're going to see over the next decade technologies that are tailored to specific tasks. I think the notion of when are computers going to be intelligent, we're not especially close to that kind of to having a good answer to that question. We're not particularly closer now to general intelligence in a computer than we were in the 50s. So that's nowhere close. The sort of Stanley Kubrick, AI building a boy who can truly love. Your guess is as good as mine when that's going to happen. But except I don't. If your guess is that it's soon, my guess is better than yours because it's not soon. In a decade, that's about as long as it takes for something that is a working prototype in the lab today to be out in the world working as a commercial product and starting to have a social impact. So that's why I picked a decade as my prediction horizon. I think that's about as far ahead as it's possible to safely predict, because it just kind of takes that long for technologies to become robust and to become deployed. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more interacting with computers and phones through non-text input modalities like vision and speech, showing it something or talking to it. We're going to see a lot of consumer modeling, so doing a better job of recommending and marketing things to you. We're going to see, basically, one question you can ask yourself is, could it be done in the cloud? And if so, rather than like intervening in the physical world, if so, there's a higher chance that it's going to come soon. So problems like translation, question answering, AI-mediated outsourcing, I think we're going to see a lot more of. Already, apparently, the technology is virtually there now to have the device that was hypothesized in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I think they call the Babelfish, right? It's a little earpiece that you would wear where you would go to a foreign country and in real time it could translate a person's speech into a language that you speak. It looks like Microsoft has been working on this and they're almost there. So again, it's not going to be perfect, it's going to say stupid things sometimes, but imagine what that would mean if you were out kind of in a place where you didn't speak the language, you could actually converse with people. Transportation, self-driving cars are not going to come in 10 years. City environments are too messy. We're not going to trust cars out with pedestrians, out on the roads on a night like tonight. But I think long-distance trucking is going to come along a lot sooner. So I think getting from a warehouse by the highway along a very controlled highway environment to another warehouse by the highway and having human drivers do the last mile, I think that's coming soon. Also, these cars are all owned by these trucks are owned by big companies. Efficiency is a major factor. So I think that one in the next 10 years we will see, maybe sooner. Industrial robotics, it's not going to move quickly. I think we're going to see increasing automation in factories. We're going to see, I think drones are the best kind of robotic technology, basically because they don't have to interact much with the environment. They can just move around in the air, which is a lot easier. But I think that's going to move slowly. I think we're going to see a lot of AI knowledge work, sort of climbing the skill ladder, so logistics planning, radiology, legal research, working in a call center. If you're embarking on a career in something like radiology or becoming a paralegal, I might think twice. If you've got a job that is basically image recognition, but really sophisticated image recognition, it doesn't matter that it's sophisticated because there's a lot of training data for it. So I think that kind of job is, at more risk. Policing and security, we know that people have a pretty endless appetite to bring new technologies and to curtail freedoms when they're in the name of security. So monitoring electronic fraud, cameras for policing, predictive policing, sending police to places where crimes might seem likely to be committed. I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of thing. And I think the question there is going to be what society will accept more so than what the technology is capable of. Things that I don't think will take off as quickly are mostly, I think, going to be areas where entrenched regulatory regimes need to be navigated. So places like healthcare, I think there's a lot we could do with AI if we wanted to, but getting through all the regulation, getting through all the established practices is going to be challenging. There exist existing social or cultural barriers to the adoption of an AI system. Places where we really care about the human touch, where it matters to us that the service is provided by a human, or where substantial new hardware would need to be provided. Notice the AI breakthroughs that I've been telling you about are mostly algorithmic software breakthroughs. They're not breakthroughs in hardware. So the hardware stuff is still going slowly. We don't have Moore's law for batteries. Batteries get a little bit better every year, but they don't get a lot better every year. So here's some examples of areas where I think we could consume almost arbitrary amounts of human labor. This is why I'm not concerned that jobs are going to go away if we still want jobs. I think childcare, healthcare, elder care, education, we could absorb a tremendous amount of new human labor in better caring for our young children, our elderly, people in hospitals. Today those jobs are we're not paying those people enough. We're not staffing those positions adequately. They have terrible turnover. They have terrible conditions. Those are all cultural choices that we've made. It doesn't have to be that way. Economically, we know if there's demand for something and people get rich enough, there's going to be supply of that thing. So I think we're going to see the economy moving in these kinds of directions. Education, we all know at UBC, there's a lot of demand for better education, and it doesn't automate well. Education is fundamentally about forming a human connection. I mean, the same with the previous examples, right? I don't want a robot to take care of my young child because I want my young child to be socialized. I want her to understand how to make human relationships, and I want someone to really relate to her. These are the kinds of reasons why I don't see any sense that AI would ever displace those kinds of jobs. I don't want a robotic personal trainer or a robotic psychologist because the whole point is that it be a human, right? That's literally the whole point. And if you know somebody who really should get counseling but it's too expensive, you just made an argument for why there's room for more human jobs, right? There's a lot of scope out there. There's a lot of demand. We won't see many consumer robots beyond niche applications, and we won't see semantically rich language understanding. We won't see, a AI system that can really understand what's good about a good novel, or that can create, a good piece of writing, because that depends on really a deep semantic understanding of what's happening in language, not just a statistical understanding, and we're nowhere close to that now. Right now, most progress in AI is due to methods for making predictions from data, where we're trying to learn these kind of input-output relationships. This is a dog, this is a cat. We're going to shift to problems that remain important even once prediction is no longer the problem. So we're going to shift in the research to thinking about questions like, how can I understand why the model made the prediction that it did? How can I certify that this model is fair, or that it's legal, that it doesn't discriminate, things like that. I'm going to be interested in counterfactual predictions. Like if I was to change something about the world, what then would have happened? I can have all of the traffic data I want about the city of Vancouver, but if that doesn't help me answer the question, what would road congestion look like if I closed the Granville Bridge? Because I don't have any data about that situation. But that's a question that I might want an answer to. So machine learning kind of, for theoretical reasons, can't answer that question. Like asking about a distribution that is different from the distribution that I'm really in. Just in general, anything about making a decision involves considering alternate states of the world and saying which one would be best. That's not about predicting something from an IID distribution, if you know what that means. It's about optimization and planning. So I think these schools of AI are going to be important. And it also doesn't tell us how to do what economists have spent the last, depending on how you count, 50, 100, many hundreds of years thinking about, of how to weigh competing objectives that different people have. How do I, aggregate people's preferences and decide what social outcome should be preferred? How do I design mechanisms for listening people's preferences and then acting on them, knowing that people might lie to me? These questions are going to become increasingly important as decisions get made in automated ways, and they're not going to get easier just because we have a computer mediating the interaction. Finally, the last kind of category of predictions I want to make is that we're going to see new technologies that are not driven by what's technologically possible, but instead that are driven by what people want. So one way you can make predictions is to look at what the technology can do and sort of play that forward. The other thing you can do is sort of ask where there's a market and ask what it would look like to serve that market. So I think entertainment is one of the things we really care about, and if people have less of a need to work than they did before, then we're going to have even more demand for entertainment. Something a lot of people don't know is that right now gaming is actually a bigger economic sector than Hollywood. So computer games are not the niche thing they once were. And I think we're going to see the lines around the game category continuing to blur. I think, what it means to be sort of broadcast, TV or movies and what it means to be a game is going to get, there's going to be some kind of intermediate gray area of kind of entertainment that is to some extent adaptive and interactive. I think we don't understand quite what that looks like yet, but there's no reason why these categories shouldn't be fundamentally changed by the existence of intelligent technologies. I think we're going to see technologies for making meaningful connections with other humans. I think Facebook is the sort of tip of the iceberg there, but it's really very primitive. If you think about the value proposition Facebook offers you, it's little text snippets and they get sorted into a feed. I think we're going to have an answer to your question like, I've got 20 minutes to kill, who wants to hang out with me? How do I stay in touch with my friends from high school that I really miss interacting with? I want to do a physical activity right now. How do I get a group of people together to have a physical activity? Like, how can I mediate, how can I use technology to solve those kind of energy barrier problems where there's probably a lot of other people out there who feel similarly, but we don't know how to find each other. That sounds to me like a problem technology can solve. Another desire people have is for free time. So I think we're going to continue to see automation of routine and unpleasant tasks. You can see this as somebody coming for the jobs of the people who do the routine and unpleasant tasks, but I think those are not jobs that anyone should have an inherent desire for. So I think we should instead see that as freeing people up no longer to do terrible things. Dishwashers automated the manual task of washing dishes, but I don't think anyone's shedding a tear. And lastly, in education, I sort of put this in both lists because I think a lot has been said about the use of AI in education, and I think it's far overblown. I think it's really hard to kind of automate education. I think it's fundamentally about human relationships. But on the other hand, the needs are so great, and in some cases, the existing benchmark solution is so poor that there's room for something to happen. So I think there's going to continue to be innovation in that space. The last thing I want to say is about superhuman intelligence. So we sometimes hear this notion that at some point AI is going to be superhuman. It's going to have superhuman capabilities. And I think this is clearly true, right? I showed you all these benchmarks where AI systems reach human-level performance in different tasks. But I don't mean to suggest by that human-level performance was the upper bound on what was possible to do in those tasks. So there's no reason why machines are not going to continue to improve once they reach human-level performance and perform better than humans in a bunch of tasks. So I think we should think about what superhuman intelligence means, and we should take a deep breath and realize that it's not really a scary thing at all. Because we actually have a lot of experience with superhuman intelligence. I argue governments, corporations, non-governmental organizations are examples of superhuman intelligences. The International Committee of the Red Cross, if I think of it as an actor, it's much more complicated in its reasoning, its decision-making, its action than any one person can be. And in fact, no one person understands everything that it does. It's just complicated. It's doing all these things at the same time, and it takes information from over here and uses it to act over there. And we're so comfortable with this that we don't even really notice that that's true. We talk about it as though it's an actor, but we don't really think about the fact that it really is, as an actor, it's a superhuman actor. And I think that's a good mental model for what an AI superhuman intelligence at some point could turn out to be, likely in the near future in restricted domains. I think the reason we're not scared by these kinds of superhuman intelligences is that we have tried and true mechanisms for making sense of them. So we know how to audit them, we know how to make laws about what they're allowed to do, we know how to spot check whether they complied with those laws, we know how to constrain them if they break those laws. And I see no reason why those same kinds of mechanisms are not going to be equally applicable to superhuman AI intelligences. So just because you can't understand the aggregate of something's behavior doesn't mean that you can't have a good handle on what it's doing, what its motivations were, whether the motivations were acceptable. You can't constrain it, you can't audit it. I think interacting with AIs in that kind of way is going to come to seem natural to us. And I don't think we should think superhuman intelligence is bad, because I think there are a lot of problems we face today that humans have not shown themselves to be very good at solving, that I think are going to require technocratic solutions that are beyond human abilities to make. I think climate change is perhaps the most glaring such example. Climate change is fundamentally a technocratic problem. How do you look across the whole economy and understand which carbon-emitting activities are the most significant and what the trade-offs are between diminishing one versus diminishing another, and just getting all of society on side to reduce our total carbon output. I think AI is going to be a big part of that solution, and I've got other examples on the slide. So to conclude, AI in 2030, I think we're going to see a continuation of the broad technological trends that have been going on now. Computing is going to keep getting faster and cheaper, especially through the cloud. We're going to keep seeing a growth in big data. We're going to digitize more information, partly through more and more ubiquitous sensing. Machine learning is going to continue to make progress on prediction given this additional data, although it's already working pretty well. And we're going to continue to see economic activity moving online and being mediated electronically. In terms of social impact, I think we're going to see living standards rise on average. Effectively, we're all going to be richer. I think we're not going to see widespread unemployment around the corner, but I think we are going to see AI automating a lot of tasks that currently require human expertise, and we're going to have to think socially about what we want to do about that, how we want to respond with our new riches to the people who are disadvantaged disproportionately by these changes, who surely will exist. And I think all of this is really going to be a story not about scientists like me, but about governments, about how societies as a whole choose to respond to all of these changes, which means that we really need to be having conversations about AI that don't happen in the computer science department, but that happen places like this. So with that, let me hear any questions or comments you might have. Potential for enough Q&A to keep us going for 2020. We've got about 10 minutes, so